FC Sochaux-Montbéliard might not be a household name like Marseille or PSG, but they are arguably the most important club in the history of French football. That's because Sochaux, who were founded as a works team for Peugeot employees almost 100 years ago, were the first French football club to admit to paying their players. At a time when doing so was strictly forbidden, they successfully spearheaded the campaign for French football to turn professional before becoming the first professional football club in the country, the first to develop their own training ground, and founding members of France's first nationwide top flight. Sochaux finished third in Group B in Ligue 1's first season, which was the 1932-33 season, though that was later upgraded to second after Antibes were disqualified due to suspected bribery. Only goal difference denied them of a spot in the first French football championship final of the professional era then, but they couldn't be denied success for long. Sochaux were the only French team to win 2 Ligue 1 titles before the outbreak of World War II, in 1935 and 1938, in addition to being losing finalists in 1937. You don't have to go back as far as the pre-war era to find Sochaux's most recent silverware though, nor to understand their enormous impact upon the French game. In 2004, Sochaux lifted the Coupe de la Ligue title in front of almost 80,000 fans at the Stade de France, and in 2007, they returned to win their first Coupe de France crown in exactly 70 years, pulling off a famous upset against a star-studded Marseille team, which featured the likes of Franck Ribéry, Samir Nasri, and Djibril Cissé. Sochaux's academy is also famously among the best in France, even forgetting the myriad of former stars and French internationals like Yannick Stopra and Jérémy Mathieu. Recent graduates include Ibrahima Konate, Marcus Thuram, Cédric Bakambu, and Maxence Lacroix. It's an esteemed bunch which helps Sochaux to compete long after Peugeot had ceased to give the club a financial advantage over their peers. And prior to 2014, Sochaux had spent 66 out of a possible 76 seasons in Ligue 1 since the league's inception. Sochaux still rank 8th in the all-time Ligue 1 table, above Rome, Lens, and PSG. That's all very interesting, Alfie, I hear you say, but why are you choosing now to make a video about FC Sochaux-Montbéliard? Well, that's because the club looks like it might be about to die. Despite looking like promising candidates to win promotion back to Ligue 1, with just 10 games remaining last season, a dreadful run of form resulted in the historic French giants finishing 9th, meanwhile failure to secure financial guarantees from their owners to remain in Ligue 2 saw Sochaux hit with an enforced relegation to the 3rd tier just last week by the DNCG, France's football finance regulators. Now Sochaux need to provide a budget to the Championnat National, a level of football they have never previously played at, but absent owners and at least 15 million euros of debt mean their prospects don't look good. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Sochaux, a commune which was built by Peugeot for a look at a football club that was abandoned by them, and others, in a tale of almost all that is wrong with modern football. It's often said that Peugeot is Sochaux, and Sochaux is Peugeot. A small commune situated just 7 miles from the French border with Switzerland, Sochaux is about 5 times closer to the Swiss capital of Bern than it is to the French capital of Paris. There is very little to be found in Sochaux. There is an Aldi supermarket, a few bars and restaurants, a theatre, and a Peugeot museum. About 2/3 of the commune is occupied by the historic Peugeot plant, now owned by Stellantis, which spills over into neighbouring Montbéliard. Though fewer than 4,000 people call Sochaux home now, roughly 16,000 are still employed at the local plant, which still produces more than 1,000 cars a day. Peugeot is technically the world's oldest automobile manufacturer, founded in 1810, a full 76 years before Carl Benz invented the first true automobile. That's because Peugeot, founded as a family business by brothers Jean-Frédéric and Jean-Pierre II Peugeot, was initially a metalworks. Ever the entrepreneurs, the Peugeot soon branched out into textiles, industrial and agricultural tools, and kitchen equipment. You can still buy, and I'm sure many of you watching this will have come across, Peugeot salt, pepper and coffee grinders, amongst other things, which the company first started manufacturing all the way back in 1840. During the 1880s, and I hope that you're enjoying this history lesson, I promise you it's going somewhere, Peugeot began manufacturing bicycles before becoming very early adopters at the beginning of the automobile boom. By the late 1920s, Peugeot's sole plant in Sochaux was producing more than 40,000 cars a year, with a rapidly expanding workforce. It was at that time that two Peugeot employees, Louis Maillard-Céline and Maurice Bailly, with the support of the factory's manager, Jean-Pierre Peugeot, founded FC Sochaux as a company football club. The famous lion on the Peugeot badge and company logo is derived from Sochaux's coat of arms, and you will find a similar looking lion on the FC Sochaux-Montbéliard badge. Soon after the club was founded, FC Sochaux very nearly folded. Through no fault of their own, it should be said. Sochaux enjoyed immediate success, but a year after they were founded, the Wall Street crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression. Peugeot sales collapsed, along with most automobile manufacturers, but the company managed to weather the storm, and in the 1930s, FC Sochaux merged with neighbouring AS Montbéliard to become FC Sochaux-Montbéliard. They pioneered professionalism, became founding members of Ligue 1, and won 2 league titles. Despite becoming the best football team in France during the 1930s, when World War II came to an end, Sochaux almost went under again. During the war, after coming under occupation, Peugeot's Sochaux plant was converted to produce German tanks and V1 flying bombs, otherwise known as doodlebugs. After the RAF tried and failed to destroy the plant, instead killing 125 civilians due to the difficulties in bombing relatively small targets, the plant's owner, Rudolf Peugeot, secretly agreed with the British to sabotage his own factory with explosive devices to stop the RAF from bombing Sochaux again. At the end of the war, it took Peugeot 6 months to get the plant back up and running, and at the end of the 1945-46 season, in which Sochaux finished bottom of the Ligue 1 table and were relegated, the Peugeot Works Council considered terminating the club on the grounds that it was a superfluous and unnecessary distraction. Peugeot employees emphatically opposed the proposals though, and the following season, the rampant line of Sochaux roared straight back up to Ligue 1 after comfortably winning the Ligue 2 title. Sochaux remained virtually a mainstay in Ligue 1 throughout most of the next 70 years, with the relationship between Peugeot and Sochaux appearing to be permanent, like that of Bayer and Bayer Leverkusen, or fellow car manufacturers Volkswagen and Wolfsburg. Until 2015, that is. Almost 90 years after founding the club, Peugeot decided to sell. By this stage, Peugeot had changed an awful lot. During the mid-1970s, Peugeot acquired one of their biggest competitors, Citroën, and the European division of Chrysler, becoming PSA Peugeot Citroën, better known as the PSA Group. Although the Sochaux plant remained crucial to the company's operations, and is today the oldest car manufacturing plant which is still in operation, PSA was no longer headquartered in Sochaux, relocating to the wealthy Paris suburb of Rueil-Malmaison. The most significant change of all, though, came in February 2014, when, after more than 200 years, the Peugeot family relinquished control of the business, reducing their holding from 25% to just 14%, whilst the French and Chinese governments, the latter through Dongfeng Motor, each acquired 14% ownership stakes, all of their own. Thierry Peugeot, son of former Peugeot chairman Pierre Peugeot, was adamant that the family should not relinquish control of the family business, but he found himself isolated and increasingly outnumbered. Instead, PSA would now be run by Carlos Tavares, a Portuguese businessman who had, until recently, been the CEO of Renault. Tavares had no connection to Sochaux, other than PSA's plant there, and certainly no connections to FC Sochaux-Montbéliard. Thierry Peugeot had a deep attachment to the club by contrast, his father having been key to its founding, but with him gone, there was virtually no resistance to PSA selling FC Sochaux. In fact, the whole spectacle became somewhat unedifying. Tavares wanted to focus solely on cars, once stating, quote, "It is not the mission of the PSA group to manage football clubs. We could only have done a very bad job at its head." End quote. Others theorised that the sale was carried out primarily to send out a message to the employees at the plant in Sochaux of their diminishing status within the context of a multinational corporation, in an effort to increase productivity. In 2019, Peugeot's head of sponsorships and partnerships, Isabel Salas Mendes, said, quote, "Football is a sport that does not go too well with our values. It conveys popular values, whereas we are trying to move up market." End quote. In other words, football fans, after 90 years, have become a bit too common and working class for Peugeot and PSA's liking. The company decided to sponsor the French Open at Roland Garros and the rugby union team Stade Toulousain instead, presumably where they felt the crowds were more upmarket and better aligned with their new values. Though it is only now that the situation for Sochaux has got so bad that the club is staring down the barrel of extinction, it was on July 7th, 2015, when PSA sold Sochaux to a company called Ligue that the club's death warrant was first signed. Because PSA had lost interest, and was, admittedly, facing serious market headwinds, with the company's value having been slashed by a third within the space of just a decade, they had already taken their eye off the ball when it came to Sochaux. Following a 5th place finish in the 2010-11 Ligue 1 season under Francis Gillot, Sochaux entered into a period of rapid decline. Star men like Brown Adai, Marvin Martin, and Modibo Maega were sold for significant fees, but only a tiny percentage of those transfer proceeds were reinvested, and in 2014, a year before Peugeot sold Sochaux, the club was relegated. Sochaux's new owners, fresh off the back of the club finishing 10th in Ligue 2, was the Hong Kong-listed company Ligue, who claim, on their website, that they strive to be a world-class green lighting solution provider for the LED industry. Though, on their website, they also have an entire tab dedicated to FC Sochaux-Montbéliard, who they haven't owned in over 3 years, so it's probably worth taking everything on there with a pinch of salt. Leadus is a subsidiary of Tech Pro Technology Development. You'd imagine that they must be really good with tech with a name like that, although their website doesn't even load, so I wouldn't be so sure. In fairness, that might just be because Tech Pro was delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in February 2020, but more on that in just a moment. Leadus' takeover came at a time of enormous Chinese investments in football, both at home and abroad. But unlike a lot of buyers of clubs throughout Europe, very little was known about Leadus. And that's largely how things would remain. Because PSA no longer cared about Sochaux and was almost boastful in its total disregard for the club, they had little interest in finding a suitable custodian to acquire ownership of an institution that they had owned for the preceding 87 years. As such, they just accepted the first offer that met their modest asking price, reported to be around €7 million, and that came from Leadus. Other reports claim that the fee was as low as €50,000, so a little bit less than a Peugeot 508 Sport, with the rest going to offset PSA's existing Sochaux-related liabilities. Over the next few seasons, despite having some remarkably gifted academy graduates, Sochaux still managed to go backwards. After Cedric Bakambu was sold for less than €2 million, Carl Toko Akambi was let go for €1 million, Marcus Thuram for just €600,000, and Ibrahima Konate for absolutely nothing. At a better managed club, those players either would have taken Sochaux back up to Ligue 1, or they would have at least been sold for a small fortune. Instead, by the 2018-19 season, Sochaux only narrowly avoided an unthinkable relegation from Ligue 2 by 2 points. By this stage, it was clear that no money was being put into the club, and that day-to-day management was, at best, rudderless, and at worst, non-existent. Faceless Leadus chief executive Li Wangsang stated, quote, "This is a great day. We hope to return to Ligue 1 in the shortest possible time," end quote, on the day that Leadus acquired the club. He was never heard from again. In October 2016, news broke in France that Wang Sang was facing bankruptcy proceedings. Tech Pro Technology Development Limited's share price crashed 92% in July 2016 alone, following an attack by short sellers, losing $1.7 billion of market share and bankrupting the company's mysterious chief executive. There had been rumours in France in 2015, coming out of Hong Kong, that Tech Pro was a bubble stock, and that their precariousness would pose a significant risk to Sochaux. And so it proved. In 2019, things got even worse when Wang Sang's assets were frozen, reportedly because he had failed to pay a €9 million debt to Credit Suisse, and it became unclear how Sochaux would fund their future endeavours. At that stage, a third party lent the club a helping hand, unofficially reported to have taken control of the club. That third party, now known to be the Nanking Group, acquired Sochaux outright in April 2020. Unlike Tech Pro, Nanking is a company with a substantial digital and real-world footprint. A large conglomerate, founded by billionaire Chinese entrepreneur Zhong Naishong during the 1990s, Nanking's business interests span the worlds of sport, finance, pharmaceuticals and services, though their initial and still their biggest sector is in real estate. Whereas 2015 was right at the peak of the China boom when it came to investment in football, as instructed by President Xi Jinping, by 2020, the complete opposite was true. Worried about capital flight and a lack of return on Chinese businesses and billionaires' investments in football overseas, President Xi had ordered for the taps to be turned off and even imposed a partial ban on the takeover of foreign football clubs. Whilst a lot of Chinese companies and billionaires were selling up then, Nanking was something of a sole exception. Upon arrival, Nanking made bold promises to Sochaux fans. Though the club had finished 14th in Ligue 2 the previous season, newly appointed general manager Samuel Laurent stated that Nanking founder Zhong Naishong's aim was to restore Sochaux's status as a top-tier club within the next 2 to 3 years. Laurent was a particularly unusual appointment by Nanking to run Sochaux's day-to-day operations. For a start, he didn't know anything about football, which, is always a drawback as the CEO of a football club, and he was apparently fairly open, at least in private, about that fact. Laurent is a writer and essayist by trade, best known for his work on Islamic extremism, having written extensively about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and French-born jihadists fighting and training overseas. Laurent's work is somewhat controversial, described as being hyperbolic by the French Ministry of the Interior, not that the validity of his research on terrorism is enormously relevant to his ability to run a football club. More significant, in terms of Laurent's character perhaps, is the fact that he claims to have fought in what was then Burma, now Myanmar, on behalf of the Karen National Liberation Army after leaving school, a claim which is flat out denied by Burmese rebels who called upon him to retract the claim on Twitter. Whilst Laurent might be clueless when it comes to football, he does actually have a strong family tie to the sport, and to Sochaux specifically. His great-nephew, Lucien Laurent, is immortalised as the man who scored the first ever goal at the FIFA World Cup in Uruguay in 1930, whilst playing his club football for Sochaux and working at the Commune's Peugeot plant. Lucien is a legend of French football, captured by the Germans during World War II and held for 3 years as a POW. He died in 2005, aged 97, as the only surviving member of France's 1930 World Cup squad, who saw them crowned as champions of the world for the very first time on home soil in 1998. It wasn't Laurent's family ties to Sochaux that saw him appointed as the club's general manager though, or even his very famous father, the journalist Eric Laurent. No, it was the fact that he was fluent in Mandarin and was already friends with Nanking founder Zhong Naishong. Surprisingly, appointing someone who knew absolutely nothing about football and wrote mainly about Islamism to run a football club, just because you know them, didn't turn out to be the first-class ticket to success that you might imagine. Instead, Laurent was taken on a ride by players, agents, and commercial partners who exploited his ignorance and the club's bizarrely deep pockets. Having been starved of cash under their bankrupt Hong Kong-based owners, Sochaux's new Guangdong-based regime wasted no time in splashing the cash. It had been over 5 years since Sochaux even paid a transfer fee when young forward Yan Kitala was signed for €300,000 from Lyon in the summer of 2020, but it was in terms of wages that Sochaux really went wild. In 3 summers, Sochaux signed 8 players from Ligue 1 teams, and all 8 arrived on Ligue 1-sized contracts. It has even been reported that this season, Sochaux had more than 5 players on contracts worth in excess of €50,000 a month in Ligue 2 before bonuses. That might not seem that obscene to English football fans. There are lots of players in the Championship who earn in excess of €50,000 a month, but Ligue 2 is not the Championship. In fact, no other second tier is even remotely like the Championship, and even then the Championship itself is an absolutely insane ticking time bomb just waiting to implode. Revenue is much lower in Ligue 2, attendances are much lower, and even the prospect of promotion is much less valuable when compared with the Championship. And Sochaux's spending put their budget in line with only the league's most recently relegated Ligue 1 teams. The fact that I quoted those earlier figures without bonuses is also significant, because under Laurent, Sochaux are reported to have created some of the most insane incentive structures and bonuses written into contracts anywhere in world football. The idea, seemingly, was to put extra emphasis on achievements and results by offering bonuses to certain players that were unheard of in Ligue 2. Inevitably, though, Sochaux's most sought-after signings and existing players didn't want to rely upon the uncertainty of lucrative bonus payments, but rather for their income to be guaranteed. The result has been a 2-tiered contract situation at Sochaux, whereby the highest earners get paid regardless of what happens out on the pitch, but low earners can see their salaries halved, or even worse, when results don't go the team's way. That is reported, unsurprisingly it must be said, to have created lots of rifts and internal divisions within the Sochaux dressing room, especially when Sochaux's form turned sour during the last 10 games of the season, breeding anger and resentment among players, for whom that meant greatly reduced salaries. With 10 games remaining last season, Sochaux were just 1 point off automatic promotion and in a rich vein of form. They went on to lose 8 of their last 10 games, finishing 9th in Ligue 2, 10 points above the bottom 3 and, quite remarkably, 20 points off promotion. Laurent, who got into a bar brawl for which he was questioned by police in November 2020, isn't the only interesting character within Sochaux's leadership structure. Steven Zhong, who is the son of Nenking's boss, also sits on the club's board, and unlike Laurent, he is said to be a big sports fan, but primarily esports. Still, it's better than nothing. Thinking about it, it really isn't, is it? Last summer, due to the enormous operating expenses Samuel Laurent has racked up at Sochaux, Nenking had to provide the club with an €8 million cash injection just to keep them going. Even then, Sochaux were very nearly kicked out of their own home ground. The Stade Auguste Bonal, which sits just inside Montbéliard but right on the edge of Sochaux, practically touching the Sochaux car plant, has a great deal of practical and sentimental value to the club. Sochaux's home since 1931, it was renamed in honour of Auguste Bonal following World War II, Sochaux's former sporting director, who was murdered during the war for refusing to cooperate with the Nazis. Renovated in 1973 and then again between 1998 and 2000, in major renovations that saw the ground virtually rebuilt but on the same site, it holds just over 20,000 fans. Sochaux have an incredibly loyal fan base. In their last season in Ligue 1, when they were relegated in the 2013-14 campaign, they still averaged over 14,000 fans at their home games. Last season, in Ligue 2, they averaged just over 12,000. That might not seem enormous, but it was the 6th highest in the division, ahead of several clubs based in much larger cities. Sochaux has a population of fewer than 4,000 people, and even Montbéliard is only home to 25,000. To average between 12 and 15,000 fans then, even during a particularly bleak period for the club, illustrates the resilience of Sochaux support. This summer, like last, unsurprisingly, given that Sochaux kept on spending, they were in need of another cash injection from Nanking. This time, however, with Sochaux's debt reportedly having swelled to €22 million and at least €11 million required for the club just to retain their Ligue 2 licence, no such injection would be forthcoming. Nanking's ownership of Sochaux, especially with Laurent actually managing their day-to-day operations, most likely always would have been disastrous. But the timing of the takeover and subsequent macro trends and events made it an even greater cocktail of destruction. Of course, in 2020, there was a deadly pathogen that caused one or two problems, most notably quite a lot of deaths and long-term illnesses, but it also cost a lot of football clubs and businesses a small fortune. Not only were Sochaux hard hit by the pandemic, whilst paying obscene wages, Nanking took an absolute battering. In 2020, the Chinese government introduced new regulations on the debt limits of property developers. Given most of these companies were leveraged up to the eyeballs, the regulations had a shocking and immediate effect, plunging China's property sector into a spiraling crisis. The Evergrande Group, China's second largest property development firm, who previously owned Guangzhou Evergrande, was the most high-profile casualty of the crisis, as the most indebted property developer on the planet. Over the last 2 years, Evergrande have posted losses of $81 billion, and their share price has fallen by over 99.99% to virtually zero. It's not just the Evergrande Group, though. JP Morgan estimates that around 50 Chinese property developers have defaulted on more than $100 billion of offshore bonds over the last 2 years. So it's unsurprising that Nanking, whose primary interests are still in real estate and property management, have been heavily impacted. Nanking's founder, Zhong Naishong, once ranked inside of the top 300 of China's rich list, with a net worth of close to $2 billion, dropped off the list entirely in 2022, along with Forbes' list of billionaires. The poor sod. Imagine not even being on Forbes' list of billionaires. When the proverbial hits the fan, just as with Peugeot, and you've no attachment to the project, as was the case with Peugeot by the end and with Nanking from the very beginning, a second-tier French football club becomes the least of your concerns. Nanking have never really shown any interest in Sochaux, outside of buying the club, and their cash injection in 2022, and now that the company is in crisis, they appear to have forgotten that they even exist. It seems almost as though Samuel Laurent was given free rein to ruin Sochaux without any oversight, and when he called this summer asking for another cheque to be written, the answer was no, if indeed his call was answered at all. Nanking claim that they don't currently have the cash on hand to write that cheque, even if they wanted. The response from the DNCG was to expel Sochaux from Ligue 2, which is already the lowest level that the club has ever played at, relegating them to the Championnat National. It is devastating for Sochaux, but there's every chance that things are going to get a lot worse. Right now, Sochaux are incapable of presenting a budget to the Championnat National that would see them admitted to the league, with the threat of bankruptcy looming large and, with it, relegation to the fifth tier of French football. Even in the Championnat National, Sochaux wouldn't generate enough revenue to cover even their most basic operating expenses. Anything worse, and fans fear that the club will cease to exist. That is now a genuine, if not quite likely, and very imminent prospect. So sealed is Sochaux's fate, as far as many are concerned, that there are already talks of following in the footsteps of Bastia. Bastia were relegated to the fifth tier, the Championnat National 3, by the DNCG in 2017, at which point the club was taken over by a couple of local businessmen and supporters and rebuilt from the ground up. Following back-to-back promotions, Bastia were back in Ligue 2 by 2021, and they finished fourth last season. Such a recovery is possible then, but there are far more examples of clubs that have collapsed and sunk without a trace. Nanking have announced that they are looking to sell the club and source a buyer, who is willing to stump up the 11 million euros required to save the club as soon as possible. One person who has expressed an interest in buying Sochaux is Jean-Claude Plessis, who served as the club's president during happier times from 1999 to 2008, in which they won 2 major trophies. But it is as yet unclear whether Plessis has the funds, could source the funds, and would be willing to cough up the necessary funds to get Sochaux admitted to the Championnat National. If he isn't, and no one else is, Sochaux will have no other choice but to fold and start again. That would mean that France's first professional football club, who built the nation's first training centre, would be stripped of both their professional status and their training ground. It is hard to imagine a more damning indictment of the modern game than that. Whilst the focus in most of the national newspapers in France and online this summer will most likely revolve around the ongoing Kylian Mbappe melodrama and what kit he will be wearing next season, and whether a tiny dictatorship and petrostate in Western Asia can get a gazillion euros for him before he leaves for nothing, a far bigger story, at least on a human level, at one of France's most historic football clubs, is unfolding 360 kilometers away in Sochaux. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel and my second channel, both of which should be on your screens or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might want to watch after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.